The afternoon I stepped forward on the dock and said it was my fault. I watched my best friend's future close like a courthouse door behind him, and I knew the sound of it would echo the rest of my life. It was August of 1956, the kind of southern heat that pressed against your lungs and made your shirt cling like a second skin. The shipyard smelled of hot tar, salt water, and diesel fuel, and the gulls wheeled overhead, shrieking like they were arguing with God. A storm had been brewing offshore all week, one of those slow Atlantic hurricanes that churned and teased the coastline without committing. The radio in the foreman's office kept crackling with warnings between Hank Williams songs, and the air itself felt restless. I was 23, all bone and stubborn pride, with cracked leather gloves tucked into my back pocket and a head full of plans I didn't yet have the money to name. My best friend, Thomas Reed, stood beside me on the scaffolding that afternoon, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, his grin crooked as ever. We'd grown up throwing rocks into the same marshes, skipping Sunday service to fish off the same pier, whispering about girls we were too shy to speak to. By 56 we were men by the calendar, but boys in everything else. Thomas had a wife at home, Mary Ellen, and a baby girl who had just learned to clap her hands. He talked about that child like she'd hung the moon herself. Every lunch break, he'd unfold a photograph from his shirt pocket and smooth it with hands still smelling of steel filings. "She's got my ears," he'd say, like that was the highest blessing a man could pass on. The accident happened quick, as most life-changing things do. We were guiding a steel beam into place along the hull of a cargo vessel that had come in from Savannah. The crane operator was new. The chain jerked once, twice, and then Thomas's foot slipped on a patch of oil slicked across the planks. He reached for the lever that steadied the load, but he pulled too hard, too fast. The beam swung wide and crashed into the side of the vessel with a metallic scream that seemed to split the sky in half. Men shouted. Someone blew a whistle. The foreman came running, red-faced and furious. The damage was visible even from where we stood, a warped panel, a seam bent wrong. Thousands of dollars, they'd say later. Weeks of delay. Thomas stared at his hands as if they no longer belonged to him. I remember the way the world narrowed then, like I was looking through the wrong end of a telescope. I knew what a mistake like that meant. The yard had let 2 men go that spring for less. Jobs were scarce enough that summer. The paper mill up north had cut shifts, and the shrimping boats weren't bringing in what they used to. A man without steady work was a man without footing. The foreman demanded to know who'd handled the lever. There was a long, terrible pause. The crane creaked overhead. The smell of hot metal hung thick and bitter. Thomas opened his mouth. I saw it happen, the flicker of panic behind his eyes, the thought of Mary Ellen at the kitchen table counting coins from a mason jar, the image of that baby girl clapping at shadows. And before he could speak, I heard my own voice say, "It was me." It came out steady, almost calm. As if I were announcing the weather. The foreman looked at me like he'd been waiting for someone to hang. "You?" "Yes, sir." Thomas turned to me, and in his face I saw 1,000 protests he didn't dare voice. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. "Don't." The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork and reprimand. They marched me into the office, the fan rattling overhead, the hurricane bulletin muttering from the radio. I signed my name at the bottom of a typed statement I barely read. My palm left a damp print on the page. By sunset, the yard had dismissed me. Word travels fast in a town that small. Faster than the tide. By the time I walked past the bait shop toward home, men were already leaning in doorways, whispering. Someone muttered, careless, loud enough for me to hear. Another shook his head like I'd broken some unspoken code. Thomas found me that night on the edge of the marsh where we used to fish as boys. The cicadas were loud, and lightning flickered far out at sea. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice thin with guilt. "You've got a family," I answered. "So do you, someday." "Not yet." He tried to give the blame back to me, like it was something he could return to the store. But I wouldn't take it. We stood there a long time, the smell of salt grass heavy around us, until finally he pressed his forehead to my shoulder like a man at prayer. I felt his tears soak into my shirt. That was the last time he cried in front of me. The yard's dismissal didn't just cost me wages. It branded me. In a place where a man's name was his handshake, I'd just torn mine in half. Other docks along the coast heard about it. When I applied at a smaller yard upriver, the supervisor glanced at my record and said they needed steady hands. He didn't look me in the eye. I took odd jobs after that, hauling shrimp traps, patching roofs, unloading trucks at the feed store. Work that paid by the day, never the week. The factory whistle at dawn no longer called my name. Sundays were the hardest. I could feel the glances in church, subtle but sharp. The pews were warm from the afternoon sun streaming through colored glass, and the hymns floated up to the rafters like always, but something in the air had shifted. Men who once clapped my back now nodded politely and turned away. Thomas kept his job. He worked harder than anyone, took extra shifts, saved enough to buy Mary Ellen a washing machine 2 years later. When he handed me the first invitation to his daughter's birthday party, he hesitated, like he wasn't sure I'd come. Of course I went. I stood in his small living room with streamers taped crooked along the ceiling, watching that little girl smear frosting across her cheeks. Thomas caught my eye from across the room, and there was gratitude there so fierce it almost looked like pain. But gratitude fades in the daylight of everyday life. Reputation doesn't. When I met your grandmother, she'd already heard the story. Small towns have a way of preserving gossip better than any archive. She asked me about it one evening as we sat on the hood of my truck near the waterfront. The jukebox music from a bar down the pier drifted toward us, Elvis, I think, though the wind made it hard to tell. Was it really your fault? She asked. I could have told her then. She would have understood. She had a steady gaze, the kind that invited truth. Instead, I looked out over the black water and said, yes. She studied me a moment longer, then nodded. All right. I married her 6 months later. There are secrets that sit between two people like a stone on the table. You learn to eat around them. You build a life around them. But they're always there. Years passed. The hurricane that summer never made landfall, but others did. I remember boarding up our windows with our first son sleeping in a drawer by the bed because we couldn't afford a crib yet. I remember listening to the wind howl and wondering if this was the price of a single sentence spoken too quickly on a dock. Thomas rose through the ranks at the yard. By the late 60s he wore a clean shirt to work and carried a clipboard instead of tools. His daughter left for college. People respected him. I remained the man who'd once mishandled a beam. Opportunities came and went. A chance to supervise at a new plant in Mobile slipped away after someone checked references. A bank loan for a small repair shop was denied with polite smiles. No one ever said it outright, but I saw the calculation in their eyes. Risk. Through it all, Thomas and I remained friends. We fished less often, talked more about mortgages and draft numbers and the way the country seemed to be splitting itself open. But every time he looked at me too long, I felt the weight of what I carried for him. One night in 1972, after too many beers and a long week, he said, "You ever regret it?" The bar smelled of stale smoke and fried oysters. The jukebox hummed low. I turned the question over in my mind like a stone. I regret the way people look at my boys, I said quietly. Like they expect them to drop something. Thomas flinched as if I'd struck him. I could tell them, he said. Tell everyone. And do what? I asked. Trade places? He had no answer for that. Regret is a strange companion. It doesn't shout. It settles into the chair beside you and stays. By the time you children were born, I had learned to live with it. I worked steady enough. We paid our bills. Your grandmother never complained, though sometimes I'd catch her studying me when she thought I wasn't looking, as if she sensed the outline of something I hadn't shown her. Then, one afternoon, I came home early and found an envelope on the kitchen table, my name written in Thomas's careful hand, the paper trembling slightly in the breeze from the open window. I stood there a long while before I touched it. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon polish and whatever your grandmother had baked that morning, cornbread, I think. Outside, cicadas rasped in the oak tree, and somewhere down the street a screen door slapped shut. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary day. But that envelope felt like a fault line running straight through the room. Thomas had never written me a letter before. Not once. We'd lived our whole lives within walking distance of each other's words. If he had something to say, he said it face to face. My hands were not steady when I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. His handwriting looked older than I remembered, less sure at the edges. He told me he'd been offered a position in Charleston. Bigger yard. Better pay. Retirement package. Mary Ellen was thrilled. Their daughter was married by then, living in Atlanta, and the house felt too quiet. Then the letter changed. "I can't carry it anymore," he wrote. "Not the way you have." He said he'd spoken with the yard's new owners, men from out of state who cared more about production schedules than old stories. He said the foreman from 56 had passed on. Records were dusty and mostly forgotten. If he came forward now, it wouldn't cost him his job. Maybe not even his reputation. Times had shifted. People were different. He wrote that he intended to set it right. The words blurred for a moment. I blinked hard and read them again. Set it right. I folded the paper carefully and sat down at the kitchen table. The chair creaked under my weight. For a long time, I listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant drone of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. I thought about what "right" meant after 16 years. It would clear my name. Maybe. It would untie a knot that had shaped every turn my life had taken. The bank manager who once declined my loan might shake my hand differently. The plant supervisor in Mobile might send a belated apology. Men in church might remember my handshake the way it used to be. But it would also peel back something I had chosen to carry. It would expose Thomas in a way he had been spared all these years. Even if the yard kept him on, people would talk. They always did. And there would be questions. Why now? Why the silence? What kind of men keep a thing like that buried? And there was something else, quieter, harder to name. If the truth came out, then my life would have been built partly on a misunderstanding. The jobs I didn't get. The nights I lay awake wondering if I'd doomed us. The way I taught you boys to double-check every bolt and every promise. The way I told you that a man's word was heavier than steel. What would that all mean if the wait had been unnecessary? Thomas came by just after dusk. He didn't knock, just stepped onto the porch where I was sitting, the boards warm from the day's heat. The air smelled of honeysuckle, and the sky was bruised purple over the marsh. "You read it," he said. I did. He lowered himself into the chair beside me. For a while, we listened to the crickets tune up for the night. "I can fix it," he said finally. I should have done it years ago. I studied his profile, the deeper lines around his mouth, the gray threading through his hair. This was not the same young man who had wept into my shoulder by the marsh. This was a grandfather now. A man who'd earned his standing the long way. "You tell them everything?" I asked. "Yes." "And what do you think happens after that?" He hesitated. "I don't know. But it'd be honest." Honest. The word hung between us like humidity. "You think I've been dishonest?" I asked quietly. His head snapped toward me. "No. Never that." We fell silent again. A screen door somewhere down the street banged shut. The smell of someone's charcoal grill drifted faintly through the air. "I made a choice," I said. "Not just that day. Every day after. I could have corrected someone. Could have let it slip. I didn't. Because of me. Because it was mine." He stared at me, confused. "That blame," I said. "I took it. I signed my name. After that, it belonged to me. You didn't steal my life, Tom. I handed you a piece of it." His voice cracked. "I never wanted it. I know." The porch light flickered on as your grandmother stepped outside, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She glanced between us, sensing something heavy in the air, but she didn't ask. She never pushed. She simply kissed the top of my head and went back inside. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Mary Ellen says it's not fair. Says you paid for my mistake." I watched a moth circle the porch bulb, drawn to the light it could never quite reach. "Fairness is a young man's measuring stick," I said. "Life's not cut that straight." He let out a long breath. "You don't want me to say anything," he said, more statement than question. I considered the answer carefully, like I had that first sentence on the dock all those years ago. If you need to, I said, for your own soul, then do it. But don't do it for me. I've lived my life the way it unfolded. I won't pretend it was someone else's. He looked at me then with something like awe, and something like sorrow. I don't know how you do that, he said. I smiled faintly. You do. You just don't see it. He left not long after. The next week, he and Mary Ellen packed their house and moved to Charleston. No announcement was made at the yard. No confession echoed across the docks. The story stayed the same as it had always been. Years rolled on. We buried your grandmother under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Thomas came back for the service, his hands shaking when he gripped mine. We never spoke of the letter again. When he passed, his daughter sent me a box of his things. Inside were old photographs, a rusted fishing lure, and that same folded sheet of lined paper. He'd kept a copy. On the back, in smaller handwriting, he'd written, "He chose it." I keep that paper in the drawer by my bed now. Sometimes, on nights when the wind off the water carries the faintest scent of salt and diesel, I take it out and run my fingers along the creases. Do I ever wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed silent that day? If I'd let him speak first? Of course I do. A man would be a fool not to trace the other paths his life might have taken. But I also look at the life that did take shape, the porch where you grandchildren once chased lightning bugs, the calluses on my hands earned honestly, the way my sons learned to stand firm when something cost them. Reputation is a loud thing. It fills rooms and travels quickly. But character is quiet. It settles in over years. It's built in moments no one applauds. That afternoon on the dock, I lost something I never quite got back. But I gained something, too, though it took me decades to see it. When you carry a weight long enough, it shapes you. It strengthens certain muscles. It bends others. It teaches you where your limits are, and where they aren't. If I had it to do over again, knowing everything I know now, feeling every consequence the way I've felt them, I would still step forward. And I would still say, it was me.